Well, good morning again. Really wonderful to be with all my friends today. And I mentioned during our sharing of joys and concerns that I did meet with this neurosurgeon over the last week with my wife and I. And, I thought it would have been really interesting if he said, well, I have some good news and I have some bad news. Which do you want first? Luckily, he didn't say that because physicians tend to be a little bit wiser with that kind of thing. Usually, they lead with the good news. And they'll begin just by telling you, oh, well, hey, good news is this and this and this. And then you're sort of waiting, smiling, and you know that something is probably coming. And then, they kind of pad you in the beginning. But if someone comes to you and says, well, I have some good news and I have some bad news, which do you want first? What is your response? What do you usually choose? You could put that in the chat if you'd like. Do you want the good news or the bad news first? And sometimes our response actually has to do with our fatigue level, right? It has to do with how we feel emotionally or physically or the recent events of our lives. It has a great deal to do with how well we are prepared for all the news that we're going to get. Some days we want to get the bad stuff out of the way, kind of like broccoli. And we have the good news as the dessert of our day. So we say, let me front load with the worst, so at least I can end this day well. But other days, we need something good to prepare us and strengthen us before tackling all the bad news. So it's like carbo loading before a big race. Now, of course, given the choice on the order of the good and bad news, most of us, probably all of us, would like to avoid the bad news altogether. And unfortunately, I'm going to begin by giving you some bad news, and that's not an option at this point. We, as feeling human beings with a great capacity for awareness and empathy, we can't fast forward through the difficult things. We can't sidestep the painful. We can't get around the suffering and the sadness in this life as hard as we try. And lately, it does seem like the bad news is relentless. Like everything is trending downward. Like it's all getting worse and worse. I hear people saying that all the time. It seems like everything is getting worse. But that's the key word today. Seems. It appears that way from where we're standing, from the particular perspective that we have, from the lenses that we happen to be looking through at any given time. So a couple of days ago, I was meditating on, I was napping on, that's the way I meditate. I lay down and I think about some stuff and then I let myself fall asleep, and wisdom hopefully comes during that time because it usually doesn't come during my waking hours. But I was meditating and napping on the things I would be sharing with you all today. And I decided to go back to the website and see what the message had been last Sunday. And I read Reverend Randy's powerful and inspiring message on the eve of Martin Luther King Day about stewarding Dr. King's dream, about working every day to make that dream a reality. And when I first saw that, started reading it, the first thing that struck me was how similar the hearts of our initial messages were. We had a great affinity in what we wanted to share with you, because I'd already begun writing a message for today, for this very time, called Between the Dreaming and the Waking. And I was trying to reconcile Martin Luther King's hopes then for the America that could be and the America that now is. The problem was, as I began to write that message, I began to feel like it would seem almost oppositional to Reverend Randy's, like it was some sort of rebuttal, because for as hopeful as his message was, mine started to feel rather hope deprived. Watching the Voting Rights Act fall in the hours just after Martin Luther King Day, I was feeling a sad resignation that the equity and the justice and the diversity of Martin Luther King's aspirational words were not realities that I was going to see in my lifetime. At least that was what I was afraid of in those moments. He didn't see them in his, and decades later, we seem as far from the dream as ever. We seem, though, there's that word again. But I really wasn't looking forward to being here with you, and the prospect of gathering with my friends who are there, part of this community, those who are watching online, and saying, you know, that dream, it's beautiful and we're stewards of it, but it's probably time for us to wake up because there's a lot that's not going to ever happen in our lifetime. I will confess that the exasperation was my companion early in this week. There was an attrition of hope as the week went on. It was just a week of bad news. You know, just one of those weeks where you're saying, could I have a little good news here? But then I realized that I had fallen into the trap of doing something that I warned you all not to do a few weeks ago, which makes total sense because most of my best advice is for other people and not for myself, just like you all, right? See, way back in 2021, just a month ago, we talked about the idea of knowing what things were in our power to affect, so that instead of looking at the ugliness and the injustice in the world and asking why and being overwhelmed by it, we would ask the question, what now? So that we could move into the fruit of the serenity prayer of differentiating what is within our power to affect and what is not, so that we lean into the former, we lean into the things that we are able to have an impact on. And I talked to you then about the question that the Stoics, the ancient Romans and Greeks asked, and the question was, what is up to me? And this week, I'd fallen into the trap of negatively editorializing the information in front of me, of deciding whether it was bad or good, and usually determining it was bad, and then letting that decision shape the story that I told myself and the frustration and despair that tended to follow. Now, you're probably more spiritually and emotionally mature than me, so you might not have ever done that recently, but maybe you have. Maybe you've been guilty of putting a negative slant on the headlines in your head. See, we're a people who live inside of a story, and we are the narrators of our own story. The world moves, right? The world moves and people do things and events take place, and we decide what that all means and the implications of that, and our emotions and perspective often flow from them. Now, if you've ever watched network news or read newspapers or use social media, you know that the people giving you the information there, they select it and edit it and package that information so it will elicit the most emotional response, whether fear or worry or anger or panic or excitement. They want you to be excited by the news, titillated by the news, to have a strong reaction to the news so that you will feel an urgency to watch or read more. From political stories on the news to health news to crime reports to the weather forecast, the editors tell you the story that brings the greatest response, the most adrenaline-producing information. They want you in that fight or flight state because then you're easily manipulated. And the worst of religion and the worst of politics and the worst of community works this way too. Get people scared and you'll be able to steer them by telling them that you will fix whatever people are terrified by. Or to those they oppose, they work to dishearten them by hitting them with a relentless barrage of what will seem like bad news. And I want you to stop and think about that. All of the bad stories that you have been being bombarded by, where they've been coming from, who's been telling you all of this, what is the source of the negative narrative that you're hearing? Because that's largely been the story for most of us, if we're honest, for the past 24 months or so, feeling like the bad news is unending. But is it? Or have we allowed ourselves to believe the mythology of our timelines and our internal editors and our worst case scenario mindsets? The The best parts of technology are the ways that it brings the world to us. The staggering amount of information that we have access to literally at our fingertips at any moment. We have almost no limits on what we have access to, no delays at all when there is news in the world. We have never had that. Decades before us, people did not have the ability to know so much about what was happening. And this is wonderful at times, right? It gives us a sense of understanding of the world. It gives us a sense of community. It actually shrinks the world down so that we can have access to people that we don't have access to geographically. But the downside of all this is that we're continually inundated with information, much of it curated to provoke us, more information than we can possibly accurately process or interpret or emotionally carry. And instead of slowing down, having the wisdom to stop and recalibrate through all this news, we tend to move faster. We scroll faster. We read more. And so in the velocity at which we're living and the emotional toll that this is taking on us, this speed and this influx of information, we begin to make snap judgments about what that news means. All that news flying by, is it good or bad? Is it part of the spiral up or the spiral down? Is it confirmation of our greatest fears, or is it oppositional to them? And the things we often see as bad news, they begin to snowball inside us. And the headlines are all suddenly horrible. What is trending in our head is hopelessness. So today's message is called Good News, Bad News, but it actually should be called a letter to the editor. And the editor is you. Because the truth is, no one gets to decide for you or for me what's bad or good news. With the countless things that happen every day, at the end of every day, we have a choice on what the headlines of that story will be. I'll give you an example. This past Thursday night on local TV, the news headline was, "Big winter storm coming with freezing temperatures and snow accumulation in dangerous conditions." The news that night, according to my kids, was, "No school tomorrow." The news, according to my wife and I, was, "Yay, another long weekend with our children." According to the grocery stores, it was all hands on deck. To families here struggling with food scarcity, it was food pantry closed today due to inclement weather. According to everyone else, apparently, it was quick. We need bread and eggs for all the French toast that we need to make. The reality is always whatever the reality is, but reality feels different depending on where we stand or what's happening to us or the lenses through which we view the world. And the most critical piece of the story that we all tell ourselves and the editing that we do is what we tell ourselves about the suffering in the world. I mentioned the passing of Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese Buddhist monk, great thinker. He passed away at the age of 95, and he had written extensively on mindfulness and self-awareness and living in the present and on gratitude. And I was going through his book called No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming Suffering. He talks about the relationship between the mud and the lotus. He said, there is mud and there is the lotus that grows out of the mud. We need the mud in order to make the lotus. Without suffering, there's no happiness. So we shouldn't discriminate against the mud. We have to learn how to embrace and cradle our own suffering and the suffering of the world with a lot of tenderness. In other words, beautiful things grow out of the manure, so don't hold it against the manure. Give thanks for it. Don't lament all the crap that you see. Stop seeing things as bad news and see them as an invitation to bring goodness. Or to put it another way, the news can always be good if we choose to make something beautiful out of that news. It's just a matter of what we allow ourselves to think and what we allow that news to produce in us. And we know this to be true. We know that looking back retrospectively at our lives, right, that our growth, that our transformation, our maturity has rarely come through pleasant or easy circumstances. It's come through pain. whether ours or someone else's. And we also know that if we look back at history, movements of justice and equity have always been born out of people collectively responding to suffering and wrong and equitable. It's never come just from people saying, look how great everything is, look how pleasant this is. And we know that seasons of comfort and ease in our lives have rarely made us more resourceful or determined, but it's been the times of struggle. We know all this. And yet we experience present pain, or we see the pain around us, and most of the times we tell ourselves a story of its badness, of its evidence that hope is lost or that nothing good is possible. And while some of the information we encounter, large-scale sickness or legislation failures or political situations or financial struggles or health diagnoses, they contain real and measurable difficulties, they still contain something else. They contain the invitation to move in response. And this is what the legacy of Dr. King has been. This is what Thich Nhat Hanh's legacy is, and of Jesus and Mother Teresa and all the people in this world who have lived their lives working for compassion and mercy and love and justice. It's been about the good news that you make, the story that you choose to write with the life that you have. We've all heard and we've talked about that phrase, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And Dr. King said that extensively, and he was known, that was one of the phrases that was attached to his life and work. But those words were actually spoken in 1871, first by Theodore Parker, who was a Unitarian minister. And we've spoken these words over and over again. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And they've been spoken as solace in times of adversity, and they've been a coping mechanism against despair for people. And they're words that we say sometimes as declaration, like this is, but most of the time it's spoken in aspiration as this could one day be. And in days like this, thinking about the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice can feel more like aspiration, like it's not something that we are holding in our hands presently. We have to decide differently, because the funny thing about the person telling you that they have good news and bad news is that they're predicting your response beforehand. They are editorializing in advance. They're anticipating what will be good and bad news to you. Now, some of that might seem, simple enough to determine, but it also doesn't take into account that we all respond differently to the same reality, and therein lies our originality and our agency and our opportunity. This is the entire point of you living and breathing and awake and alive to hear these words today, so that you can be an arc bender, to see all the information in front of you and decide, I'm going to craft a better story. That has always been the work of good human beings on this planet. And really, the truth is, as bad as we think things are, there is nothing new under the sun. I came across this story this morning, a video of Dr. Martin Luther King. You may have seen it, you may have read it, or you may not even know it exists. But in 1963, Dr. King was in Washington, and he was giving interviews about a potential civil rights act at the time that President John F. Kennedy pitched a month earlier. And one of the interviews that Dr. King did was on a television show called Press Conference USA, and it was a government-funded show, and it was broadcast internationally. But by law, it couldn't air until 12 years here after it was recorded. But Dr. King is asked about the Civil Rights Bill, and I want you to hear what he says. He said, "This would certainly be all right with me, because I think the vast majority of people in the United States would vote favorably for such a bill." He says, "I think the tragedy is that we have a Congress with a Senate that has a minority of misguided senators who will use the filibuster to keep the majority of people from even voting. They won't let the majority senators vote, and certainly they wouldn't want the majority of people to vote, because they know they do not represent the majority of the American people. In fact, they represent in their own states a very small minority. It's been that way all through the South," he said. So nearly 60 years ago, Dr. King was facing a strikingly similar reality to ours, and yet he didn't wilt under the emotional weight of it all, because he knew that that aspiration is actually the antidote to resignation. That resignation is hopelessness, that it stops us from working and fighting and creating and dreaming. And hopelessness can never find solutions because it has decided that the bad news is permanent. But the hope, the aspiration, propels us forward, not ignoring the suffering, but allowing it to fuel us to something redemptive. So no, we can't avoid the bad news. We can't fast forward through the difficult things. We can't sidestep the painful, and we can't get around the suffering and the sadness in this life. But maybe that's actually the good news. Maybe that is showing us who we are, what matters to us, and why our presence here at this place in time in the history of the planet is so important. So that's pretty good news.